How do you take your true crime? Do you like to sit back and sip on a cold drink while someone tells you a story in a soothing voice? There's no better way to explore the dark underbelly of the Deep South. My podcast, Southern Fried True Crime, is like sitting on a front porch listening to a friend tell you a story, with the slow pull of a slide guitar drawing you in closer. I'm Erica Kelly, and every Friday I spin a new Southern tale, giving you the history of the town, the background of the community and victims, as well as the details of a uniquely Southern crime. Explore historic cases with me, like the saga of Cullen and Priscilla Davis in Fort Worth, Texas. It's the perfect example of money and power trumping justice in the South. Or contemporary cases like the death of Andrew Lewis, a young man shot in the back of the head. The shooter claimed self-defense, and Montgomery, Alabama officials refused to charge him or conduct a proper investigation. I am also passionate about wrongful convictions, domestic violence, and rape culture. Southern Fried True Crime pulls no punches, breaking down the good old boy system. I shoot straight about how racism, elitism, and political connections affect justice in the South. Southern charm is attempted, but I can promise you some Southern sass. So pull up a chair and subscribe if you're interested. I'd love to have you. You can find me on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and many other podcast apps. Just search for Southern Fried True Crime. Until then, y'all take care.
You're listening to Scene of the Crime, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, and 3 Men and a Mystery. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Last week, we discussed the crime scene in room 260. Now let's take a look at the investigation conducted there. As is standard procedure in cases such as this, crime scene techs were called in to find, preserve, and document the evidence found in room 260. It's unclear exactly how carefully evidence was preserved. Tim Trishman recalls that
as far as I know, the room, obviously, the interior of the room was, they had it blocked off for 1 to 2 months that we weren't able to go into the room. It was turned over to us, maybe a month or 6 weeks later, 2 months at the outset. So it was out of service for quite a while.
Others, including now Iowa County Sheriff Rotter, who has studied this case extensively, note that some of the crime scene photos show that things were moved around.
Unfortunately, that's where it comes in with not knowing whether you have accurate depictions in the pictures of where things really were. I know that things are moving around. So were they moved around to that extent that furniture was actually moved? I know for a fact that a chair was, because you can see it in the pictures. It changes locations. So were those chairs put there during the crime, before the crime, after the crime? If you want to assume that they were placed by the killer or killers, does any of that have anything to do with our murder? Does it indicate that they knew their victims and that they were having conversations about things? Or is it just something that's completely benign? I don't know.
In the crime scene photos, ashtrays fill up with ashes and other evidentiary items are seen in different places. The checkbook with the fingerprint on it was listed as found on the nightstand, but it was not there in the crime scene photos. Here is Larry Atkinson.
They really blotched it. They didn't.
Yeah, they did.
They didn't take half of the pictures of the room, and a lot of the pictures we reviewed them. Sheriff Router let us review the pictures, and they pointed out how even furniture was moved around.
Sheriff Rotter explains what he thinks took place.
The DCI crime scene folks had actually come from another murder scene when they went to this one. And I suspect that they were running low on supplies and just did what they could with what they had. That's my suspicion, because there really aren't a lot of photos, considering the type of murder this were. And another thing that leads me to believe this is there are objects in the room that are being moved while these pictures are being taken. And I remember as a young officer, before we had digital cameras, you look at your camera and I only got 3 pictures left on my camera, so I'm going to move a few of these objects so that I can get everything in one shot, not really considering how important the position of those objects might be later. We're just trying to document the things that are in the room and not necessarily position. And I wonder if there wasn't a little bit of that, because you can see that a chair is moving. There are some towels that are moving that are not being consistent with one picture to the next. And then just the sheer number, there just aren't enough. So the crime scene photos, there should be 4 or 5 times more than what there is.
We can only hope that the disruption to the crime scene was minimal and inconsequential. Once the room was photographed, deputies set about dusting the room and its contents for fingerprints. As Tim Trishman noted,
Understand fingerprints, in the guest rooms and hotels, there's fingerprints all over the place.
as we know, one partial fingerprint was lifted from a checkbook belonging to Rose, found on one of the bedside tables. This could not be attributed to anyone detectives printed throughout the investigation. Odds were that it belonged to the killer, since the checkbook was also scribbled on with soap. If this print was matched to any others in the room, we are unaware of that. As the manager pointed out, it's likely that Tex lifted numerous prints, but that most, if not all of them, aside from the one on the checkbook, were from previous occupants of the hotel room. The room was not the only area examined and dusted. Here is Tim Trishman.
And then the hallway to that room leading from the second floor to the first floor. So there was a stairwell involved. And then the exit door going to the west side of the parking lot. Those were areas where they spent most of their time. Did they look at other areas? I assume so, but my involvement with the sheriff's department and the BCI, those were the ones that were the most importance to them, looking at doors, fingerprints in that immediate vicinity.
Iowa County Sheriff Spurrier sent the partial print from the checkbook to other jurisdictions nationwide in search of a match, but came up empty. Paul Holes examined the blood spatter spray patterns on the walls, ceiling, and headboard, and drew the conclusion that someone had been standing on Roger's side of the bed when the blows were struck. Here is Paul Holes.
And this is where I'm starting to take a look at the number of blows being inflicted to Rose versus Roger and whether or not that provides any significance. Is there anything else going on in the scene that might differentiate who the offender was primarily targeting, such as Roger's wallet just being, taken apart, like the offender is just spiting Roger for being involved in this affair?
But in contradiction to the evidence that Roger was the target, as the killer stood over his side of the bed, was the fact that Rose received more blows. Here is Paul Holes.
That's something that I really focused in on is the difference in the number of blows that the offender is inflicting between Rose and Roger. And that here you have Roger, the male, who's actually the bigger physical threat to the offender inside that hotel room. Yet Rose is the one that is receiving more of the blows. So does that indicate that the offender had greater emotions and rage towards Rose than Roger? Is he simply dispatching Roger and then taking out his anger on Rose for her, let's say, her involvement, her affair with Roger? And then if that's the case, then that would tend to suggest that the offender in his mind had some sort of relationship with Rose. Initially assessing this case, initially I'm going, Rose is she's the focus because she's got more injuries. he's showing more rage towards her. And then, well, no, this is more from the reconstruction. This is more a result of the actual attack circumstances than the offender's interpersonal relationship aspect. And then the pendulum swings the opposite way when I'm taking a look at what he did to Roger's wallet versus Rose's wallet, going, oh, Roger's the focus.
Paul Holes concluded that the level of rage and violence inflicted on each individual victim was not as telling as the number of blows would seem to indicate.
I went in through the crime scene, in the crime scene reconstruction, start to understand that the blows are being inflicted to Roger and Rose from Roger's side of the bed. And that makes sense. The offender is going to be closest to the biggest threat to him and to try to neutralize him early. But then he's also standing on Roger's side of the bed and having to reach over to inflict the blows to Rose. And many of the blows that he inflicted to her were not of the same power, didn't penetrate as deeply as like what you see with Roger. He was less effective with those blows. And in fact, it looks like Rose ends up turning. She receives some additional blows to her shoulder. And this may, and quite frankly, I think this is the reason why the offender is inflicting more blows to Rose is he is not as effective having to do that long reach. He cannot deliver these blows as powerfully, and she is moving. And so he's now having to repeatedly hit her with this hatchet, and it is a hatchet or a very similar weapon in order to kill her. And so I think that the difference in the number of blows is more a result of the circumstances of the attack versus the emotional connection that the offender had, or the differences in the emotional connections that the offender had between Roger and Rose.
But regardless of who was struck more times, the question remained, why would the second victim, presumably Rose, simply lie there, awaiting her impending doom, as her partner was bludgeoned and killed next to her? Did the couple perhaps know their killer and not feel as though their lives were in danger until it was much, much too late? Perhaps the killer suddenly struck a blow to Roger, then one to Rose, and then finished off the job with additional blows to each? Here is Paul Holes.
He was not, per his family, somebody who was really an aggressive personality. And it's possible that Roger made an assessment that, you know what, if we just do what this guy says, he'll take money or whatever else and we'll survive this. And so the victimology potentially could account for why Roger didn't physically confront this offender. But we don't know.
No one could answer these perplexing questions. Sheriff Rotter says that investigators have racked their brains to figure out why Rose and Roger placidly lay still and allowed themselves to be struck.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we've certainly spent a lot of time thinking about, and it also helps a person think that maybe there were two people. Was somebody holding them by gunpoint while someone else was doing something else? Was there a gun involved? It seems to me that you have to do something to convince people to stay in their bed and not try to fight back. If you think you're about to be killed, I think you would do anything you could to escape that.
Again, here is Paul Holes.
In assessing this particular case, somebody who is going to take on two adults at once with just a hatchet, and we don't know if that's all this offender had. He most certainly could have had a gun with him to help control the situation. But if he's only in there with a hatchet, that's at great risk to him. He has the confidence, the self-confidence to be able to take on these two adults. I mean, Roger easily could have gotten up, or if he was already up, confronted a guy with a hatchet, gotten into a physical struggle, and Rose could have run out. But that didn't happen. So this offender was able to control these two adults as well as had the confidence that he could enter this room with two adults. And I'm assuming that he knows that there was two in there. The positioning of the offender in that room is absolutely critical. When somebody wants to control a person inside a space, they will position themselves in that room between the exit and the person and the victim. But this offender isn't doing that. He enters all the way into that room, is on Roger's side of the bed. If Roger and Rose are still alive, both of them could have gotten up and possibly both could have escaped, if not one of them escaped, because they didn't have the offender standing in their way at that point.
Since there was no evidence that Roger and Rose were tied up or restrained, yet lay there while they were under attack, investigators surmised that the offender must have had some way to subdue them, such as a gun. No doubt he chose not to use a gun to murder them, as the noise would have been heard throughout the hotel. Or the victims could have complied with directives to lie still on the bed because they knew their killer and assumed that if they cooperated with him, he would not harm them. This episode is sponsored by Green Chef. What is Green Chef? Green Chef is a USDA-certified organic company that makes eating well easy and affordable with plans to fit every kind of lifestyle. Green Chef lets you choose from a wide array of easy-to-follow lifestyles with select organic ingredients, and recipes are quick and easy with step-by-step instructions, chef tips, and photos to guide you along. Everything is hand-picked and delivered right to your door. With Green Chef's wide variety of high-quality, clean ingredients, you can feel great about what you're eating and how it got to your table. Meal plans include vegan, vegetarian, paleo, and keto. I just tried the beef and butternut squash chili, and my family loved it. Even my 7-year-old ate it. Best of all, it saved me a lot of time, making dinner easier, and I get the peace of mind knowing that my family enjoyed a delicious and wholesome meal. To start enjoying Green Chef for yourself, go to greenchef.com/scene80 and use code SCENE80 to get $80 off across 4 boxes, including free shipping on your first box. Once again, go to greenchef.com/scene80 and use code SCENE80 to get $80 off across 4 boxes, including free shipping on your first box. Pretty much everything in the room was gathered as potential evidence by the Iowa County Sheriff's Department. This included all of Rose and Roger's personal items, all of the bedding, and even some of the furniture and wall hangings, including the bathroom door and headboard. A hair found on the nightstand was bagged, as was a roll of film, the standard issue hotel room items like the drinking glasses, phone book, and ashtray. In fact, they pretty much cleaned the room out. Again, Tim Trishman.
They took everything. Almost everything. They took all of the furniture that was in the room, except for the mattress and the box springs were left. It was a king size room, so they left the king size mattress and box springs. They took some or all of the lampshades, maybe some of the freestanding lamps, perhaps, and some of the items in the bathroom, the mirror that was on the wall in the bathroom they took. They didn't take things that were fastened down like tubs or vanities, but anything movable, they removed from the room.
The items taken from room 260 were labeled and tagged in accordance with the standards of the time. These items included the Do Not Disturb sign from the door, all the bedding, the scattered personal items on the floor and throughout the room, the headboard, pillows, the nightstand from Roger's side, and all the towels, all the courtesy hotel items in the room, such as the ice bucket, drinking glasses, fly swatter, and phone book, the soap remnants found on the carpeting, the tube of Crest toothpaste, samples of a stain from the bathroom wall, a piece of scalp found in the bed, the wallet, glasses, keys, and deck of cards found on Rose's side of the bed, the registration card where Roger had signed into the hotel as Roger E. Burkert, even the shower rod and the bathroom door from the WC. Investigators were careful to document the items found scattered on the floor on Roger's side of the bed. Some of these were spattered with blood. As suggested in the detective's notes, it seems that the killer went through Roger's wallet and pulled out the contents, discarding them on the floor after destroying some of them. DCI agent Richard Gregory even posited that given the vindictive and seemingly personal nature of the crime, it was possible that the rifling of the wallet and dumping out of Rose's purse was designed to cover up the true motive. Sheriff Rotter agrees that the mirage of a robbery gone bad could explain the ransacking of the room.
Is that maybe why there are things around the room? Or were the people that were doing this making it look like it was a robbery? And look, I'm here to steal from you. I'm here to rob from you. Is that why they're going through the wallet?
Here is what was found littering the carpet on Roger's side of the bed.
The business card of J. Scott Wallace, Indianola, Iowa, a furniture cabinetry maker, was found wadded up under the bed. A photograph of a female child with information on the back indicating that it was to Roger and Marcella, and that the girl was Janine Leanne H. was torn up. An American Express traveler's check, torn in a number of pieces, was determined to be $50, dated August 27, 1980, to James Halter, and had been signed by Rose Burkert. A picture with the name Betsy Eileen H. on the back, and this is a photograph of a young female child. Kmart check cashing cards for both Roger Atkinson and Rose Burkert. A check cashing card for Rose Burkert. Membership card for GSC Grocery Supply Company. Business card for Norton and Schmidt Consulting Engineers. Business card for First Baptist Church, Richard Leinberger, pastor. Business card for Larry Atkinson for the Howard, Needles, Tamman, and Bergendoff Architects, Kansas City, Missouri. A calendar card for Swanson Drive-In Market, Countyside East Center, Savannah, Missouri. Blank check for the First Community State Bank, orange in color. 7 deposit slips on the First Community State Bank in various amounts.
As we said, Roger's wallet was emptied, and it was noted that some cash appeared to be missing, in addition to all the items ripped up and scattered on the floor. Yet Rose's wallet lay next to her on the bed, intact, but spattered with drops of blood. A quick discussion of the clothing found in the room is in order. Roger and Rose had packed a lot of clothes for themselves. Rose had been staying with Roger since Wednesday of that week, so she needed clothes for 4 days. Roger, however, needed clothes for 2 5-day work weeks and 1 romantic weekend. The contents of the room were inventoried, and a list of all the clothing and personal items was compiled. Roger had a suitcase in the room, and also a full suitcase that was found in the car, presumably containing his work things that he didn't anticipate needing over the weekend. Rose had brought enough clothes with her for a trip much longer than the one she was on, with at least 6 pairs of blue jeans, a skirt, a dress, shorts, multiple pairs of shoes, 9 pairs of underwear, and 11 pairs of socks. One of the DCI agents describing the neatly folded blue jeans noted that it appeared that the blue jeans were very clean, and when picked up by this agent, it felt as if the blue jeans were damp. Perhaps Rose had done laundry on that Friday while waiting for Roger to get off work, and the clothes had not been completely dried. The list of personal items found in the couple's luggage and in the room is heartbreaking. All the normal accoutrements that would be expected, such as, "Gee, you smell terrific" shampoo, Ban roll-on deodorant, and a curling iron, but also some less expected intimate items like 9 bars of soap, feminine hygiene products, and a bottle of Summer's Eve douche. In an event telling of the state of investigatory methodologies in 1980, many of the victims' personal items were returned to their families on Sunday, less than 48 hours after their murder. Rose's things were handed off to her half-sister, Margie Lowry. Roger's were given to his brother, Larry Atkinson. Some of the personal items were delivered to the wrong family. Margie Lowry found a pair of Roger's jeans in Rose's things. These items had to be switched out at a later date by the bereaved siblings of the dead. Besides the hotel room, another possible crime scene had to be investigated for potential clues. As we know, Roger and Rose drove up to Iowa in Rose's vehicle. And there is an incident involving the car that is potentially significant, but surprisingly is only just touched on in the police files. Sometime that evening, either Roger or Rose went out to the parking lot to move Rose's car. Cars of guests at the Holiday Inn were not assigned designated parking spots. They parked wherever they could find a space. And Rose's car had been parked in a handicapped spot. It seems likely that Roger and Rose had parked in the only available spot near the lobby, wanting to check in and not have to carry their bags a long distance. But eventually, the occupants of room 260 were asked to move the Chevy Malibu registered to their room. Tim Trishman.
Yes, that's my recollection as well. I wasn't there at that time they were asked, but apparently, if memory serves me, they parked in a accessible or handicapped parking space and didn't have the tags, and the hotel was full. So there would have been no extra parking or very little extra parking. So if someone came, needed an accessible parking spot and didn't find one or didn't get one, I don't know how it came up. But my hunch would be is that someone complained that there was a car parked in a no parking area for accessibility, and they were asked to move.
It was reported in the papers that this car moving occurred sometime after 9 p.m., but we cannot confirm this. But we do know that investigators were also able to obtain pertinent information from guests of the hotel that evening who left the premises for dinner around 8:40 p.m. These guests walked by the breezeway between the two buildings of the hotel, outside the south wing, near the door that led into the hotel right near the bottom of the staircase to room 260. When these guests departed the hotel, there was no car parked in the no parking spot in front of the walkway between the buildings. This was one of those spots that is emblazoned with diagonal lines and reads "No parking" in big letters because it is in front of a loading zone or other entrance. In this case, the no parking area was in front of the entrance to a pedestrian walkway. But when these guests returned from dinner around 11:30, there was a car in that spot. This location would have been the closest possible parking spot, even though it was not a legitimate one, to Roger and Rose's room. Rose's car was found parked in a no parking area at the entrance to the pedestrian breezeway that led from the parking lot to a door into the hotel. This was the kind of door that is placed so that guests in that part of the hotel, far from the main entrance, can exit and get to their cars without walking all the way around the hotel. The Chevy Malibu was left in a spot that was as close as possible to room 260, but was not a proper parking spot. This information was verified by another guest who told police he observed a car with Missouri tags parked in the no parking spot by the breezeway around 10:30 p.m. Remember that this was in a quite visible location, one that clearly was not intended to be occupied by a car, so it's not hard to see why the car was noticed by the other guests. Police inferred that either Roger or Rose had moved the vehicle sometime after 8:40 and before 10:30, perhaps leaving it in the no parking spot for lack of availability of any other spots. Rose's car was found parked in that same spot the next day. It would have been visible from the window of room 260 up above. So why does the car moving scenario matter? Remember, investigators had no clue as to how the killer got into Roger and Rose's room. One theory that began to take shape when it was discovered that the vehicle had been moved that night was that perhaps, if it was Rose who went out to move her car, she could have been overpowered by someone. Roger's family has considered this. Here is Elizabeth Atkinson.
we were told is that they had parked Rose's car, that's what Roger and Rose were in, parked outside the hotel, had parked into a handicap spot, and apparently they thought that Rose had gone down to move the car. And then the rumor was, and this was by Slockett, saying, well, perhaps Rose went down to move the car and was accosted in the parking lot.
Remember, we saw from the autopsy results that Rose had bruising on one of her hands. Could someone have been watching for her, observed her come through the lobby and relocate the vehicle, grabbed her, and forced her into the rear door, up the stairs, and into the room where she would die? The car was processed in place. DCI agent Wade Kistner meticulously covered Rose's car in fingerprint dust, lifting 7 prints, and also recovered a hair from the floor mat of the vehicle. The car was towed away for processing, and eventually multiple items were inventoried and collected from the vehicle, including, among other things, sunglasses, Roger's GTE ID tag, 2 soft drink cups, a road map, clothing, magazines, 2 books, a bag of trash, 4 men's shirts on hangers, a hanging clothing bag, a pen, a cassette player, multiple pairs of men's and women's shoes, and a small cooler. A crossword puzzle book was collected that had written on it in a woman's hand, "I love you, Roger Atkinson, Roger, Rose, and Rachel." Rachel was the name of Rose's child. Also in the car was a green suitcase containing a lot of Roger Atkinson's clothing, a booklet on adoption, finger and toenail clippers, and 2 books on tape entitled The True Masculine Role and Marriage Divine Style. Interestingly, in the glove box was found a pack of birth control pills, but the reports do not say whether the pack had been opened or partially consumed. Reports from those processing the vehicle noted that Sheriff Spurrier had opened the trunk, having been informed that Rose Burkert had a baby whose whereabouts were unknown. There was no child in the trunk, but there was plenty of random other stuff like laundry detergent and a hot air popcorn popper. Rose's car was processed over the weekend in Iowa and given to Margie Lowry to drive back to Missouri after she ID'd her sister's body on Sunday, September 14th. The car was covered in fingerprint dust when Margie collected it.
I went up there and they let me drive it home that day after I identified her body. They already had fingerprinted it and everything else because I had to take it to a car wash to get all the fingerprinting off of the car.
So the car didn't hold any clues to what had happened to Roger and Rose. If police found any unidentified prints in the car, that is not reflected in the police files and does not appear to have been material to the case. One of the most difficult, but also most important, part of any detective's job is contacting the next of kin of a murder victim. Listeners know that statistically, murders are committed by people close to the victims. Detectives must carefully observe the family members' reactions when being informed that their loved one has been killed to see if there is any notable reaction. As we saw in episode 1, both Roger and Rose had very large extended families with lots of siblings and other relatives. The familial relationships on Roger's side were also entangled with work relationships. He worked or had worked with quite a few of his relatives. Bear with us as we address these complex family dynamics. At 3:45 on the 13th, the day the bodies were found, Detective Howard Judd of the Buchanan County Sheriff's Department was contacted by Agent Richard Gregory of the Iowa DCI. Gregory relayed to Judd that they were working on a murder scene in Iowa and that the 2 victims, who had checked into the hotel as Mr. and Mrs. Roger Burkert, were actually Roger Atkinson and Rose Burkert from the St. Joseph area. He asked Judd to commence tracking down next of kin and contacting them regarding the tragic deaths of their loved ones. Here is Detective Ron Fisher of the St. Joseph PD.
My name's Ron Fisher. I spent 25 years and one day on the St. Joe Police Department. On September 13th, 1980, myself and Detective Judd, Lieutenant Boyer, and I think Detective Mike Herter. Mike Herter has since passed. We were working the weekend, and we were getting ready to go home, and Lieutenant Boyer says, we can't go home. Two St. Joe people and the area people got axed to death up in the Manor Colonies in Iowa.
On Saturday night, September 13th, Detective Ron Fisher and Buchanan County Sheriff's Deputy Harold Judd went to the home of Catherine Rourke, Rose's sister. She was listed as Rose's emergency contact in her address book, found in the hotel room. When no one was at home, they switched gears and went to Roger's house to try to find his wife, Marcella.
They called down and asked for our assistance. I mean, I don't know if it was the Sheriff's Department or the IBI, Iowa Bureau of Investigation got involved in it too. And like I say, they asked for assistance to go down there and notify. We had to notify Atkinson widow, had to notify her of her husband's death, and that's when Detective Jed and I went to her dad's house, Hatcher, Floyd Hatcher.
Now, Marcella was not staying at her and Roger's home that weekend. In fact, for the week of September 8th and over the weekend that Roger was killed, she was babysitting the kids of a couple who attended Marcella and Roger's church, the Blacks. So, Detectives Judd and Fisher found no one at home at the Atkinson residence either. After being told by a neighbor that Marcella's parents, Nellie and Floyd Hatcher, lived nearby, the detectives proceeded there and informed the two who they found at home of their son-in-law's death. Here is Detective Fisher.
When Detective Judd and I notified Floyd Hatcher, he was about half drunk, but it didn't faze him much.
Nellie Hatcher agreed to provide information regarding Roger's work colleagues who had traveled to Cahokia with him, whom she believed numbered 4 in total. She went over to the Atkinsons' house and returned with a card bearing the name and contact information of Roger's supervisor at GTE, Randy H. At 8 p.m., Nellie was finally able to reach her daughter by phone and ask her to come over. Here is Marcella.
Well, I had been to Kansas City with the girl that I was babysitting. I had taken her to Kansas City on a shopping trip because her mom wanted her to have a dress to wear to a wedding. She was like 12. She was 11 or 12. I think she had just turned 12. And so we had spent the day in Kansas City shopping for a dress for her for this wedding. And I hadn't been back very long with her, back to her house from Kansas City, when I had a phone call from my mom, and she said, well, could you come over for a little bit? And that was very unusual for my mom to ask me to leave a babysitting job and come to her house. And I was like, well, you know, we just got home. I was going to need to be fixing dinner. And why are you asking me to come to your house? And she says, well, can you just come over for a little bit? You know, there was that kind of conversation of not wanting to say anything, but to get me over there. So when we got there, I noticed there were more cars there than my mom and dad's. And I was like, you know, what's going on here? And my first thought was that something had happened to my dad, because my dad was an alcoholic and had a very, you know, he had a very unstable life. You know, if anybody's dealt with an alcoholic, they know what that is. Anyway, so I thought it was my dad. Something had happened to my dad, seeing these strange cars. So I get to the door, and my aunt comes out and takes Lisa, the girl that I was babysitting, away so she doesn't hear anything. It's the conversation that's going on. And I go in the house, and there's these 2 men in suits sitting there with my mom and dad. So then I'm like, okay, this isn't about dad, because there's dad. Apparently it's not about him. I mean, he's still alive. So, and so then, you know, it was introduced that they were detectives. And if I remember, they started asking a lot of questions first before they ever gave me information. You know, like, where's Roger? How long has he been gone? Or where's he at? Why is he there? And things like that.
Marcella's mother told her that Roger had died in some kind of accident. The detectives then told her that actually it appeared to be a murder. When Marcella learned that her husband's ID had been found on a murder victim in Iowa, she was taken aback. It took her a while to digest what the detectives were saying. She still believed Roger to be working in Cahokia, Missouri at this time. She describes her feelings upon hearing the news.
When the detectives told me that a body had been found in Iowa and they were sure it was Roger's, I was dumbfounded because I said, no, it can't be. He's in Missouri. You know, he's in Cahokia, Missouri. Somebody must have stolen his ID and that person's been killed, and now you think that's him up in Iowa, because I couldn't hardly process the fact that he's in Iowa when he's supposed to be in Missouri. I didn't have any idea of any trip to Iowa. My understanding before he left on Monday, I believe it was the 8th, he told me that he would be working 2 weeks in Cahokia, Missouri, that he'd be working through the weekend until he came back that next weekend. So to my understanding, I thought he was going to still be at Cahokia working and even working through the weekend. And I understand that he was asked to work the weekend, but said that he was going to go up to Iowa with his wife. Now that information was told by the supervisor that was on the job there at the time.
The supervisor on the Cahokia job later told investigators that Roger had passed Rose off as his wife. Roger's wife's reaction was interesting, according to the detective's notes we reviewed. Marcella instantly volunteered that they had been having problems, and she wondered if Roger had killed himself. Detective Judd overheard her say to her parents, not intending for him to hear, that she had told Roger that if he left her, she would commit suicide. Roger, she noted, had told her earlier in the week not to bother calling him over the weekend in Cahokia, as he and his crew would be working. Based on how upset Marcella was, she had to be sedated. Detectives made a judgment call not to add insult to injury by telling her that her husband had been found with another woman. Here is Marcella.
Well, if I remember, the stuff they gave me or that I was given, it seems like it lasted a day or two. You know, I mean, they tried to keep me pretty out, you know, for a day or two. But it did begin to register with me after Larry went up and identified the body and said, you know, that is Roger. I mean, that brought it more real. And then the fact that he didn't call. I remember telling the detectives, you've made a mistake. Yeah, somebody's stolen his ID and that's on a different body, but he's in Missouri and he'll be calling me any time to tell me that this has all been a mistake, that this is, you know, this isn't real. And when he didn't call that night and he didn't call the next day and he didn't call the next day, then I pretty well figured it was real.
But eventually they told her this unsettling piece of news.
Well, I don't know if it was because I was so adamant saying he can't be in Iowa, he's in Missouri. They did go ahead and say after a while that he was found with another woman and said her name was Rose and asked me if I knew a Rose. And I was like, Rose? And the Rose I thought of was in the solar energy group. There was the secretary or treasurer, whatever she was, or maybe she was both. Her name was Rose something. I don't remember what her last name was. But, and anyway, when they said Rose, I thought, oh my gosh, we've been going to this solar energy thing and that's been happening under my nose. You know, he's been having an affair with her. So that's who I thought it was. And when they said Rose Burkert, that wasn't the name of this gal. Like I said, I don't remember now what her last name was, but I was like, I don't know a Rose Burkert. I don't have any idea who she is.
Detectives met with Marcella again on September the 14th in the afternoon. By then, she was more composed and was able to discuss Rose Burkert. She told detectives she did not know this woman and knew nothing about any relationship between Rose and Roger. Marcella later told a reporter, quote, "It surprised me when I found out. I did not even know of this girl. I didn't even know she existed. I don't know of any of my relatives who knew he was doing that. Marcella would prove to be wrong about this. Roger's blood relations also had to be informed of the terrible news. Roger's sister Rita and her husband Mike H. lived in St. Joseph, and Mike was a co-worker of Roger's who had helped him get the job at GTE a few years earlier, although they worked in different departments. Roger's brother Larry Atkinson and his wife Elizabeth had also recently moved to St. Joseph. The four of them and their kids had gone to a street festival called Pioneer Days in the town of Edgerton that evening. They arrived back at the Atkinsons' home after the festival, and waiting for them were Buchanan County Sheriff's Department deputies. Here is Larry.
Mike and Rita and their kids planned on and did come down, I think it was a Saturday, to go with us to this little town half mile from us, Edgerton, for Edgerton had an annual festival type thing, all kinds of stuff going on. So Mike and Rita and kids came, and we all went down there together to this festival. And we stayed, it was dark. I don't know if it was 10 or 11, whatever. And so we come back to our property here. At that time, Elizabeth and I and the kids were living in a small camping trailer because we were under construction. We were building our house. And so when we drove up the driveway, and it's a quarter mile long, and time we got up top the hill, here we saw flashing lights up by the barn where our trailer was, and we drove up there in a sheriff's car. And it's then when the sheriff told us that there was a homicide, and at the, we I guess homicide didn't click with us what had happened or whatever, and then they told us that Roger was dead.
As the deputies were talking to Larry and Elizabeth, informing them that a man had been found dead who had been tentatively ID'd as Roger Atkinson, the house phone rang and was answered by Mike H. The caller was Gary S., another co-worker of Mike H.'s and Roger's at GTE. Gary's brother Ken was married to another of Roger's sisters, Betty, meaning that Gary and Roger were related by marriage. Gary told Mike H. that Roger had been killed in a double homicide. Because Roger's family was not home that evening, authorities in St. Joseph had called Betty Smith at her home in Idaho Falls. After learning of this horrific news, Mike H. and Rita went home, and Larry, the only one of Roger's brothers who was present as well as the eldest of the Atkinson siblings, resigned himself to head up to Iowa the next day to view the body in the morgue. But first, Larry had to inform his and Roger's parents about the death of their son. He called them at their home in Tucson, Arizona, waking them in the middle of the night to deliver the terrible news.
It was hard, but it was something that I knew I had to do. My folks weren't here, and I'm the oldest of the seven, so I just felt it was my duty to do that. I had to do it. So, yeah, it was hard.
The next day, Sunday morning at 5 a.m., Marcella and her father, Floyd, showed up at Larry and Elizabeth's home to let them know how Roger was killed.
And I remember of hearing tire tracks on our driveway, which when it starts as a highway, it starts curving and coming up a hill. And so I wasn't sure what it was. I don't know if I tried to wake LJ or not, but I got up and went out, and lo and behold, here is Mr. Hatcher and Marcella telling us, or I think LJ must have gotten up. I don't know. I'd have to read my interview again. But that's when they told us that he had been murdered with a hatchet.
We already heard how investigators broke the news to Marcella. Next, they tried to figure out Rose's situation. They sent an officer, a Lieutenant Terry Boyer, to the Andrew County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Reed Miller's agency had jurisdiction over Rose's domicile and place of employment. In a typical small-town turn of events, St. Joseph PD patrolman Pat Shea knew Rose, as she was the first cousin of his girlfriend. He went to Andrew County to the home of Francis and Donald Burkert, Rose's aunt and uncle. Then Lieutenant Boyer and detectives Herder, Judd, and Fisher went to Sheriff Miller's office and informed him of the murder of Rose Burkert and the circumstances. Her sister Margie Lowry, as we saw, was appointed to view the body in Iowa the next day. Meanwhile, despite having been told about the double murder, Roger's family did not immediately realize the ramifications of what had happened. That Roger had been killed along with a woman who was not his wife.
No, we were shocked. The front page on the Sunday page was a picture of Roger and a female. And I'm trying, because in my own mind, I always assumed it was a coworker, a man. And when I looked, and I'm thinking, who is this woman? What? And then is when it slowly started sinking in. Oh my gosh, he was with another woman. We didn't know that.
I either didn't listen or pay attention when the sheriff told us about homicide. All I was focused in was Roger. I didn't know there was another person until later. We didn't know of this Rose, and we didn't know Roger was involved with her.
In addition to deputies and other personnel from the Iowa County Sheriff's Office, deputies from the Johnson County, Iowa Sheriff's Department and from Missouri's Buchanan County Sheriff's Office assisted in the investigation. Buchanan County Sheriff's Department Captain Howard Judd, who worked the case, described the scene as pretty gruesome and overkill, although he did not personally see the carnage in the hotel room. Both sheriff's departments were assisted by the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, which did extensive work on the case. Background investigation with regard to the victims was conducted by DCI agents Gregory and Maurer in the St. Joseph, Missouri area, with assistance of the St. Joseph Police Department and other law enforcement agencies. The reality was, with the crime scene in one state and the victims and their friends and family in another, 5 or more law enforcement agencies were required to work the case collaboratively. And this was not easy in the days before cell phones. A command center was set up in a room at the Holiday Inn to serve as a central location for the different law enforcement agencies working the case. 2 hotel rooms were set aside for interviews of dining and bar staff, front desk, back office and switchboard personnel, cleaning and maintenance workers, and hotel guests. But communication was slow and inconsistent in the days after the murders, as the various investigative agencies learned to work together within the confines of communications technology. Often, it would take investigators hours or even days to get a hold of one another by telephone to compare notes or provide information. Of course, it was also problematic that it was not really clear who was in charge. There were conflicting opinions over whether the crime should be considered an Iowa crime, since that's where it occurred, or a Missouri crime, since that's where the victimology would require the focus of the investigative efforts to be. Here is Elizabeth Atkinson.
The St. Joe Police Department argued with the Iowa Police Department of who should be in control of the investigation, and the St. Joe Police Department wanted to be into it. The Iowa investigator said, no, it's because it happened in Iowa. They're going to take it on. So there was a lot of conflict between those two departments.
They didn't cooperate with each other very much.
And from there on, it kind of went downhill because because the St. Joe investigator finally backed off over years of trying to figure out what's going on. The Iowa investigators took over.
Here is Sheriff Rotter.
The one thing about this murder that I've always considered it in this way is that it really is a Missouri murder that happens in Iowa.
Yet Iowa authorities, including Sheriff Rotter, have been working the case for 40 years. To further confuse things on the investigative side, Sheriff William Spurrier, the 22-year veteran Iowa County Sheriff, lost a re-election bid just a few weeks after the murders by a margin of 250 votes. The new incoming sheriff was James Slockett. He had to get up to speed very quickly. And Slockett preferred to do things old school, conducting much of the investigation personally and not taking a lot of notes that we could locate. Here is Larry Atkeson.
And the sheriff at that time, Slockett, was one of those good old county, good old boys, and he didn't know squat about investigating or anything like that. It was just, it just kind of blotched.
The state's chief investigative agency, the DCI, was also involved, and Slockett would publicly butt heads with their agents in the years to come. The families of the victims complained throughout much of the investigation that they were left out of the loop. They expressed concern in multiple media stories that investigators were being too secretive and were refusing to share information with the families. An article in the St. Joseph News Press on September 16, 1980, only 4 days after the murders, says that the investigation remained, quote, under a cloak of secrecy by law enforcement officers. That article went on to say, quote, the secrecy by Iowa authorities, including the possible means used to slay the victims, has resulted in swarms of rumors. This has resulted in the spreading of even more rumors. Margie Lowry told us,
we had questions. They, of course, would not answer questions because it was an ongoing investigation. Little by little, we would learn different things. They could have answered just a few simple questions that would have helped with the process. That they didn't.
Roger's relatives echo the frustration of the families desperate for answers.
The detectives in that, they really didn't share their findings.
The scope of the investigation was daunting. Tim Trishman told us the Amana Holiday Inn averaged about 80% capacity year-round. On a normal Friday night, the hotel would be expected to have many guests, but on this particular night, thanks to gatherings being hosted on its premises by the Iowa Association of Cemeteries and the Faith Christian Reformed Church, the number of guests and employees who had to be tracked down and questioned numbered over 400. One group, the Bryan World Tour Group, had not registered guests individually, so investigators had to reach out to the company to obtain a list of participants. Investigators laboriously compiled the names and addresses of all guests in the hotel the night of September 12th to 13th. Many guests had checked out of the hotel and moved on, and had to be tracked down by DCI with cooperation of agencies in other towns and states. Sheriff Rotter believes that this aspect of the investigation was very thorough.
They had the entire list of everyone who not only was working there, but was staying there. They also had the list of the hotel. There was a hotel across the street that they also had the guest list from, and really canvassed every human being that was in that hotel that night and the adjacent hotel. They got plate numbers. They got, owners of plates or of cars. So the canvas was actually very good. It took a while because this is on Interstate 80. A lot of these people were transient and would have left before they even knew. You checked out early in the morning and off you went down the road. You didn't know that there was a double homicide at the hotel you were staying at. So it took some time to track everybody down. But eventually they did track everybody down, and the list is pretty extensive.
Despite the publicity accorded by the media to the Association of Cemeteries conference at the Holiday Inn, there is nothing in the files that indicates that any of the morticians in attendance raised investigators' eyebrows. Like the other hotel guests, they were interviewed and checked off the list, although presumably, due to their unconventional and somewhat dark profession, they were thoroughly vetted. Perhaps investigators surmised that the violent and brutal crime did not seem to mesh with the type of murder one imagines a mortician would carry out. Surely a murderous undertaker would be inclined to be more subtle and to leave fewer marks on his victims for his colleagues to disguise. In any event, none of them appear to have raised red flags in the minds of authorities. Every name on the guest registry was run through police record systems to determine whether any of them had criminal records. Any criminal records that we are aware of among the guests were for non-violent offenses such as reckless driving or drunk and disorderly. One of the first things investigators looked at was whether room 260, which remember, Rose and Roger were assigned only because of a cancellation, had originally been intended for someone else, someone who was perhaps the target of this killer. In other words, did the killer believe that someone else was staying in room 260 that night? But this did not appear likely. Specific rooms were not assigned when reservations were made. Tim Trishman told us.
That almost never happened, particularly for individual reservations. They're never assigned a room number until the day of the reservation. Now, where there are certain room types, a room with 2 double beds versus a size room, there were 4 small meeting rooms that had Murphy beds, some of them that had limited availability. And if you were familiar and had been at the hotel before, you might request a room number. But as a general rule, no rooms were assigned and no room numbers were assigned until the day of the reservation.
When guests arrived, they checked in and were assigned a room per their specifications, 2 double beds, a queen-size bed, and so on. Tim Trishman told us even back in 1980, this process was computerized using the holodeck system employed by the hotel. DCI records indicate that there were 4 cancellations for that evening, and they tracked down those persons and interviewed them. 3 of them had, for whatever reason, chosen to stay instead at a different Amana area hotel, the Colony House. One of them, an H.G. Freivogel, appeared to have canceled his trip altogether. In a contemporary news article, Sheriff Spurrier noted that they are also looking into the background of the person who canceled the reservation for that room. As far as we know, this angle of the investigation generated no leads. We can't proceed with the story of the murders of Roger and Rose until we address the issue of hotel security. How did this couple's killer get access to the hotel? Nowadays, hotels have digital passkeys required to use the elevators, exit doors are locked, and generally, people have to pass through the front lobby to enter hotel premises. But our story takes place in 1980, and in short, entry into the Amana Holiday Inn was a piece of cake. There were multiple entrances through the main lobby, through the restaurant, and through several other doors that connected the interior of the hotel to the outside. One of these was at the bottom of the stairwell that was just 1 room away from room 260. And all of these doors were kept unlocked. Hotel manager Tim Trishman talked to us about the security, or lack thereof, at the hotel in 1980.
There were at least 3 different avenues for ingress to the hotel. There was 156 rooms. There was a 96-room building, about 100-room building built in 1969, and then an addition done in 1973. So at that time, there was no such thing as key cards. And so there were entrances at both sides of the building where this incident occurred that were not monitored nor locked, plus coming through the lobby at several different locations, Some could have been seen by staff and some could not. At that time, there was unlimited access 24 hours a day to any of the buildings or guest rooms.
Furthermore, Tim confirmed for us that there was no video monitoring or other type of camera system in place in the hotel. Again, it was 1980, and while some places of business probably did employ primitive video monitoring systems, the Holiday Inn in Williamsburg, Iowa was not one of them. Furthermore, once the hotel quieted down for the night, it was not likely that anyone was around to observe the comings and goings that took place via entrances other than the lobby. Tim Trishman again.
There was no security. After the bar typically closed anywhere from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. in the morning, so there'd be staff in the restaurant. There was also a hotel staff member, the night auditor, that came on at 11 o'clock, and they were typically the only person on duty from that time until 7 in the morning. The restaurant staff started coming in about 5 to do prep work for the next day, but no security and minimal staff during the night. No one would have been stopping people asking for keys or identification, so it was free movement throughout the hotel.
Investigators realized with dismay that literally anyone could have walked into the hotel off the street, carried out the brutal double murder, and slipped into the darkness, never having been seen by anyone. Here is Sheriff Rotter.
I don't think security there was much of it. The room is accessible through another exit point that does not involve the front lobby. It's a rear exit to the southwest corner of the complex, and they were in the second story, but very close to the stairwell. So a person going to and from there from the outside would simply go up that stairwell, and within a few feet have the door of Roger and Rose. So now, of course, we have the key cards, and you open the bottom door with the key card. This is pre-key card. This is still the old key, hotel key days. So those doors really would have provided no security.
And here is Paul Holes.
And that's that door that's on that southwestern side of the hotel, where all he has to do is walk up a stairwell, take a couple of rights, walk 10 feet from the stairs, and he's at the front door of that room.
It was that easy, but of course, the killer would have had to know what room Roger and Rose were in and the layout of the Holiday Inn. After the murders were committed and the killer cleaned up, it's possible that he still had some blood spatter on his person or clothing, and he was carrying the weapon he had used on Roger and Rose. In order for him to get out of the hotel without being seen, all he had to do was quietly go out the door of room 260, turn left into the hallway, go down the deserted stairs to the first floor, and slip out of the nearby door into the parking lot and away. Paul Holes ruminated about the killer's accessing of the hotel.
This offender would be putting himself at greater risk to walk in through the front lobby, where people are going to look at him. Hotel employees are going to look at him. You had this Undertaker convention going on, so it is a busy hotel that is completely full. So I would imagine there was a lot of people milling about. And then he would have to walk all the way to the far southwestern part of the hotel, down the hallways where people are going to be constantly coming and going from their rooms, and he'd be seen by so many people.
On the other hand, the bustling nature of the hotel could have worked in the killer's favor.
The numbers of people inside the hotel could work to his advantage. He could blend in. I think if he's planning this kind of crime, that the smart person is going to choose to go into the door in which he is limiting the number of people who he could potentially run across.
What about security in the individual hotel rooms? In other words, investigators wondered, how did the killer enter room 260? The room doors at the Amana Holiday Inn were the type that closed behind you, and as Tim Trishman told us,
it automatically closed and locked.
So if the door was closed, the doors could not be opened from the outside without a key. Each room was also equipped with supplemental internal locks. Tim Trishman described them for us.
So there are two different locking mechanisms on that door, and then a supplemental chain slide lock inside. So there was the mortise key, the door that shuts, the lock that shuts, and then there was a night lock, which is a separate bolt that could be opened with a special key from the outside or a thumb latch on the inside.
The doors to all the guest rooms had peepholes built in, meaning that if someone had knocked on the door, Roger and Rose could see who it was. Of course, there is the strong possibility that they permitted their killer to enter. It was someone they opened the door to, even someone they knew. We will consider this theory momentarily, but if their killer was a stranger, he or she could possibly have opened the door using some kind of tool or a key. No keys issued to any staff members or guests were reported missing that night. But one interesting thing noted by investigators was that a so-called night emergency key was kept at the front desk of the hotel, and its existence was known to the management and staff at the hotel. This key could be used to access any room, regardless of whether it was deadbolted or the night lock was engaged. The key was kept in the desk under the control of the night manager. Tim Trishman confirmed this for us.
Those would be secured at the front desk area, typically either a general manager, myself, or a manager on duty, or a supervisor. At that time of the night, with only one person on duty, they would have access to those keys to, in an emergency, would be able to unlock doors.
Someone who worked at the hotel could have used this key to enter room 260 and replaced it after the deed was done. But there were other, more likely ways to gain access. DCI agents investigating the scene hired a locksmith, a Kenneth Saylor Jr., to come in and see how easy it was for someone to access room 260 without a key. Remember, these doors were opened with actual keys, not the plastic cards we use today. Saylor was able to open the door in under 10 seconds. He inspected the door and reported that it did not appear that someone had used any kind of contraption to remove the interior chain lock from the door from the outside. The obvious conclusion was that the chain was not in place. Tim Trishman says that on that night, the occupants of room 260 used
just the one lock. The chain was not on.
Sheriff Rotter confirms for us that this internal night lock was not engaged.
If the night lock was not on, the door was very easy to open. They actually had people who could use a credit card to slip that lock literally within a second. So we do know that the night lock was not at least being used when the bodies were found. There was no forced entry, so we have to assume that the night lock probably was not in use, and they just basically slipped the lock.
Saylor also demonstrated to the agents that when plastic was used to jimmy open the lock from the outside, it left visible marks on the weather stripping around the door. Such marks were not visible on the stripping around the door of room 260 when it was first photographed by crime scene techs. It was looking more and more as though Roger or Rose had opened the door themselves. Here is Sheriff Rotter.
Or they knocked on the door and Rose or Roger let them in. Keeping in mind, again, they have no reason to be worried that someone's going to hurt them. They're not being threatened. It's a very noisy hotel that night. I try to put myself in that position. I'm staying in a hotel that's very busy. There's a lot of people coming and going, and you hear a lot of noise, and somebody knocks on your door. Wouldn't I just open it? I mean, I don't think it's that hard to think that you might just open your door.
Who on earth would Roger and Rose, secret lovers on a weekend tryst, allow into their hotel room? It would almost certainly have to be someone they knew very well. Larry Atkinson, Roger's brother.
Into the room, the hotel room, it wasn't a forced entry. So one of them, Rose or Roger, evidently knew or recognized whoever was at the door, and they let him in, because Roger was always very secure about things.
Had someone called and said, "Hey, I'm in town too, let me come up for a quick hello?" It still doesn't seem very likely that the couple would have hosted another person in their room. It seems too intimate. Of course, they could have been surprised and strong-armed by someone. Here is Elizabeth Atkinson.
Maybe they had a false alarm room service and they opened the door.
Someone could have knocked on the door and pretended to be hotel staff or another guest, and Roger or Rose just cracked the door to see what they wanted and were forced back. We know that the room had a peephole, so we have to wonder how this all went down. Sheriff Rotter poses the questions we are all thinking.
That goes back to the idea is, did they know their killer? Did they know who it was that came to the door and let them in, or did they just basically barge in once the door was open? Hard to say, but it's just another angle to consider is, how did they get in once the door was open? Did they just walk in? Did they display a gun, a knife, or something? Was there screams? That was the other thing is, people say, well, how can you kill two people without someone hearing the screams?
One fact that really threw investigators for a loop and continues to raise questions to this day is why Roger was in his undershorts while Rose was dressed. Rose was wearing jeans and a blouse with bare feet. This strange circumstance caused investigators to look into some more unconventional theories as to whom Roger and Rose would have granted access to their room. This leads us to a theory that was looked into fairly extensively. One possible angle of the case that was investigated was whether Roger and Rose were affiliated with any sex swinger groups. Apparently, the DCI got wind that a nationwide swinger lifestyle organization was based in St. Joseph. St. Joseph Detective John Muhlenbacher advised the DCI that an organization known as NVSA, located in St. Joseph, Missouri, was the national headquarters of a swinger group and was operated by two men with the last name Fetty. On October 1st, 1980, Special Agent Gregory contacted the Buchanan County Prosecuting Attorney Investigator Howard Kemper regarding this sex swinger group. Kemper told the DCI agent that he had been investigating this organization for some time because they had received complaints about extortion of swinger group members. It was decided to look into whether Roger and Rose, with their extramarital relationship, could have been involved in this type of activity. The investigators' notes on this topic make it clear that although swinging isn't illegal, authorities believed that this type of unconventional sexual behavior was deviant and immoral, and that people who would engage in it were likely to engage in other illicit activities. As we know, investigators were stymied as to how the killer gained access to room 260 and why Roger was found deceased in his underwear while Rose was dressed. Further, the autopsy revealed evidence of so-called deviant sexual acts in Rose's examination. It noted that there was no semen present, but there was evidence of anal sex, and the medical examiner drew no conclusions about whether Rose had possibly been raped. It was not even mentioned. Investigators may have made the leap to believing that Roger and Rose had opened the hotel room door to someone they had invited to their room, something they would seem unlikely to do unless it was to conduct certain private activities. In any event, investigators compiled the names of people allegedly involved in the swingers group who had hailed from Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. No connection between either of Roger and Rose and the membership of the St. Joseph-based swinger organization was found. Review of the membership listings of NVSA had no record of Roger or Rose as members. Neither of them was on the mailing list for this group. And Margie Lowry denies that Rose would have been involved in anything of this type.
But as far as a swinger lifestyle, no. She was busy taking care of her child, her job, and just trying to lead a normal life.
This appears to have been another dead end. This concludes episode 2. Please join us next week as we continue with the investigation into the murder of Rose and Roger. If you have any information about the murders of Roger Atkinson and Rose Burkert, please contact the Iowa County Sheriff's Office at 319-642-7307. Scene of the Crime is a production of AbJack Entertainment. It's narrated by me, Jamie Rice, and co-produced by Jessica Betancourt, Gray Hughes, and Mike Morford. It's written by Jessica Betancourt. Special thanks goes out to the family members and friends of Roger Atkinson and Rose Burkert who participated in this podcast. Thanks also goes out to Sheriff Rob Rotter and the Iowa County Sheriff's Department, Paul Holes, Ron Fisher, Tim Trishman, and Ida Block. If you'd like to help Scene of the Crime reach new listeners, be sure to subscribe to the show and leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please recommend this podcast to your friends. You can find Scene of the Crime on Twitter at Scene of Crime Pod and on Facebook.